In almost every account of the University Museum's history, there is a reproduction of a photograph taken by John Henry Haynes during the museum's expedition to Nippur, an ancient Sumerian city. The high-contrast album in print provides a bird's-eye view that was taken from the top of the semi-buried ruins of the Ziggurat of Enlil, the main god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Captured in the evening, the anonymous silhouettes of approximately 50 people encircle a lengthy mound by the structure. In contrast to the great shadows permeating the landscape, the ruin shines bright on the horizon, lending the scene a mysterious aura. The vast empty landscape that envelops the group is nonetheless slightly unsettling, as it underscores their meagerness in the face of the massive desolation of the desert. Throughout its history, the University Museum has sponsored hundreds of global archaeological expeditions. It was this one, however, that remains the most legendary, as it pitted two predominant figures against each other: the German Assyriologist Hermann Hilprecht and archaeologist John Peters. According to Peters, in the writing The History of the Expedition, Hilprecht was intentionally misrepresenting his role, claiming all the success and distorting the findings. The scandal threatened at the time to consume the institution permanently. The only absent voice in the debate was that of John Haynes, the aforementioned photographer. Hilprecht had only been on site for 3 months during the first campaign and a few weeks during the last. Peters was in the field during the first 2 years of the 10-year expedition. Haynes, in contrast, was present throughout all 4 campaigns. Yet at the time of the 1905 controversy, more than a decade of being exposed to the punishing conditions of the desert, he had gone insane. Haynes was born in Rowe, Massachusetts in 1849, where he grew up on a farm that he had diligently managed upon the passing of his father. In 1880, Haynes went on an expedition to Crete, during which he assisted William James Stillman, a famous artist and photographer who taught him how to use a camera. In 1888, Haynes was invited by the University Museum to join its first expedition to the Orient as business manager, photographer, and field director. It was determined that the city of Niffer, ancient Nippur, was the most promising site to explore.
What they thought Hilprecht was going to find were objects similar to what the British Museum and the Louvre had found, which were things like these magnificent stone bulls that you've probably seen in the British Museum. Wonderful stone objects. However, Hilprecht was not aiming at northern Iraq, which is where the British Museum and the Louvre had been digging. He was going south into what was then basically marshland and desert. But it had become clear to scholars by this point in the 1870s and 1880s that although there was a lot of tablets, cuneiform tablets, to be found in the north of Mesopotamia, in Assyria, that the true heartland of Mesopotamian culture had been the south, Babylonia, and so that was where Hilprecht was going to go.
In order to facilitate the work, the Babylonian Exploration Fund convinced the State Department to create a consular position in the region. In 1889, Haynes unexpectedly received the historical honor of being the first American consul in Baghdad. The first Nippur expedition was a disaster in practically every respect, with the assault of the burning sun, dust, and insects, as well as the danger faced by the surrounding hostile tribes.
The site of Nippur had long since, the Euphrates had long since shifted its banks, and so essentially it was natural desert. And I think someone described it somewhere as like a moonscape or something. So the degree of difficulty we talk about archaeological expeditions. This was almost like a military expedition. Not only were you going into very harsh terrain, but also the tribespeople who lived in the general area had a very tenuous connection to any actual proper government in Baghdad. So all the way through the expedition, they would have problems of diplomatic problems of actually getting on with both the tribes, the various tribes, getting on with the Ottoman administration in Baghdad, and then finally the Central Ottoman government in Constantinople.
Despite these difficulties, the university arranged for a second campaign, comprising of only Peters, Haynes, and an interpreter, after Hilprecht dropped out. It was in 1891, toward the end of this venture, that their efforts began paying off. The group found a number of cuneiform tablets. This success prompted the creation of yet a third expedition, this time without Peters. It was thus up to Haynes alone to conduct the research for 3 solitary years without any formal training in archaeology. Peters and Hilprecht did not, however, hold Haynes in high regard, and would constantly complain about his slow pace and lack of methodology. Haynes dug out more than 20,000 cuneiform clay tablets, some of which contained ancient Sumerian mythological narratives. Referring to it in his correspondence as the library, it was likely the largest literary body of Sumerian literature and possibly the oldest text known to man. Hilprecht took Haynes' lead and claimed that they had found the Temple Library of Nippur. In retrospect, this was an exaggeration, as we now know what Haynes uncovered was a scribal quarter where young students were taught to write. While on vacation in Baghdad in 1894, Haynes befriended Joseph A. Mayer, an American MIT graduate student in the Department of Architecture. Haynes invited Mayer to join him at the site, and Mayer accepted. Mayer's presence had a positive impact on the expedition as it significantly altered Haynes' mood. The loneliness of the desert pushed the two to develop a powerful bond which seemed to go beyond a routine friendship. However, Mayer's health soon began to decline and he was sent to Baghdad for medical care. He died shortly before Christmas of that year. This was a blow to Haynes, who found himself alone once again and in immense pain. He sounded almost paranoid in his letters, saying that the violence and constant harassment by local tribes was untenable. It was clear to everyone at the time that Haynes was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
Desert, fighting tribesmen, fighting administrators, fighting Hilprecht is difficult to know, but I mean he essentially spent, I think, something like 12 lonely years out at this site in the middle of nowhere, and it eventually unhinged him.
Haynes was sent home for a year to regroup before heading out on the final expedition. In the interim, he married Cassandra Artella Haynes and was permitted to bring her to Nippur along with 2 young assistants. At that time, the university decided to take the scientific directorship away from Peters and assign it to Haynes. Despite the continuing discoveries of the tablets, the campaign team gradually turned into a form of dysfunctional family with accusations flying from one to another. The Babylonian Exploration Fund became concerned that the campaign was heading in an aimless direction and pressured Hilprecht to go into Nippur. When he got there, he realized the extent of the mismanagement of the site, and he took command of the operation. The university was so impressed with Hilprecht that he gave him a hero's welcome upon his return. This dramatic visit may very well have won him ownership of the Nippur expedition. In contrast, Haynes returned in poor health and lacking the mental and physical disposition to take possession of his own accomplishments. His wife Cassandra left him, and he consequently moved into his sister's house in North Adams, where he died on June 29, 1910.
His achievement, I think, tended to be undervalued. Firstly, because Hilprecht himself was a bit of a glory hog. So he was the leader of the expedition, and his main way of interacting with the rest of the expedition seemed to be to criticise them, and anything that was going wrong was always the fault of subordinates. So I think for a long time there was a feeling that Haynes was a fairly incompetent archaeologist, But what we find now as we go back into the archives, that yes, his recording was fairly rudimentary, but when you actually start looking at it carefully, he was, he basically knew what he was doing. He was recording the stuff reasonably well, at least for the time, and he is a great pioneer of archaeology. He's basically a forgotten man these days, but he's the hero of this expedition.
Despite all his efforts, his name is now a mere footnote in a story in which he was a primary author. Anonymous like the scribes who wrote the cuneiform tablets he helped to rescue from the depths of the desert.